Okay, so this is a guest essay in the New York Times, but I'm reading it here, and this is Reddit, right there. Because under the New York Times, you have to sign up in order to read this stuff. So this says, why China's people no longer look up to America, by Wang Wen, Executive Dean of the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies. And the link right here to the article in the New York Times. My generation of Chinese looked up to the United States. When I was a university student in northwestern China in the late 1990s, my friends and I tuned in to shortwave broadcasts of Voice of America, polishing our English while soaking up American and world news. We flocked to packed lecture halls whenever a visiting American professor was on campus. It was a thrilling time. China was emerging from isolationism and poverty, and as we looked to the future, we studied democracy, market economics, equality, and other deals that made America great. We couldn't realistically adopt them all because of China's conditions, but our lives were transformed as we recalibrated our economy on a U.S. blueprint. Decades earlier, a reform-minded scholar said that even the moon in the United States was rounder than in China. My schoolmates and I wanted to believe it, but after years of watching America's wars overseas, reckless economic policies, and destructive partisanship culminated in last year's disgraceful assault on the U.S. Capitol, many Chinese, including me, can barely make out that shining beacon anymore. Yet, as relations between our countries deteriorate, the United States blames us. Secretary of State Antony Blinken did so in May, saying that China was undermining the rules-based world order and could not be relied upon to change its trajectory. I have misgivings about some of my country's policies, and I recognize that some criticisms of my government's policies are justified. But Americans must also recognize that the U.S. behavior is hardly setting a good example. The shift in Chinese attitudes wasn't a given, but when U.S.-led NATO forces mistakenly bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, Serbia, in 1999 during the Kosovo War, our idolizing of America began to wane. 3 people were killed in that attack, and 20 were wounded. 2 years later, a U.S. spy plane and a Chinese fighter jet collided in the South China Sea, leaving a Chinese pilot dead. These incidents may have seemed relatively minor to Americans, but they shocked us. We had largely avoided foreign wars and were not used to our citizens dying in conflicts involving other countries. The shift in perception gained pace as the 2000s unfolded and more Chinese had televisions. We watched as the carnage of America's disastrous involvement in Iraq, launched in 2003 on false pretense, was beamed into our homes. following his predecessors, President Barack Obama announced a string of weapons sales to Taiwan and embarked on his so-called pivot to Asia, which we regarded as an attempt to rally our Asian neighbors against us. President Donald Trump declared a destructive trade war against us, and Chinese citizens were as shocked as anyone when a pro-Trump mob stormed the citadel of American democracy on January 6, 2021. The visit to Taiwan last week by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has only further disappointed many Chinese who saw it as a violation of U.S. commitments on Taiwan. China's critics in the United States need to realize that American actions such as these are causing outcomes in China that even the United States doesn't want. It's no accident that China's military spending, a source of concern in Washington for years, began rising in the early 2000s after the Belgrade bombing and the plane collision. It quickly took off after the war in Iraq showcased how far ahead the U.S. military was compared with ours. China's past weaknesses have been calamitous. Western powers attacked and forced China to surrender territory in the 1800s, and Japan's brutal invasion in the 20th century killed millions. U.S. officials no doubt want China to follow the American path of liberalism, but in contrast to my university days, the tone of Chinese academic research on the United States has shifted markedly. Chinese government officials used to consult me on the benefits of American capital markets and other economic concepts. Now, I am called upon to discuss U.S. cautionary tales, such as the factors that led to the financial crisis. We once sought to learn from U.S. successes. Now we study its mistakes so that we can avoid them. The sense of America as a dangerous force in the world has filtered into the Chinese public's attitudes as well. In 2020, I remarked on a Chinese television program that we still have much to learn from the United States, and was attacked on Chinese social media. I stick to my view, but I'm now more careful in talking positively about the United States. When I do, I preface it with a criticism. Protests in New York demanded an end to Asian violence in 2021, and that's an image right there. Chinese students still want to study at U.S. universities, but are acutely fearful of American gun violence, anti-Asian attacks, right, or being labeled a spy. They are sent off with ominous advice. Don't stray from campus. Watch what you say. Back away from conflict. And despite Chinese wariness with our country's tough zero COVID policy, America's dismal record on the pandemic has only strengthened Chinese public support for our government. To be clear, China needs to change too. It needs to be more open to dialogue with the United States. Refrain from using U.S. problems as an excuse to go slow on reform, and respond more calmly and constructively to American criticism on things like the trade policy and human rights. But although we don't enjoy the same rights as Americans, many in China like where we are right now. In the late 1970s, China was exhausted and traumatized from the destruction and hardship caused by the Cultural Revolution. which nearly destroyed us. Deng Xiaoping initiated reforms that brought stability and helped lift 800 million people out of poverty. We have achieved spectacular increases in income and life expectancy and stayed out of foreign wars. Tough firearm regulations allow us to walk down any street in the country at night with virtually no fear of harm. When we look at America's enormous pandemic toll, gun violence, political divisions, and the attack on the U.S. Capitol, it only reminds Chinese people of our own chaotic past that we have left behind. None of this is meant to gloat over America's troubles. A strong, stable, and responsible United States is good for the world. China still has much to learn from America. We have a lot in common. We drive Chinese-built Fords and Teslas, wash our hair with Procter & Gamble shampoos, and sip coffee at Starbucks. Solving some of the planet's biggest problems requires that we work together. But that doesn't mean following America over the cliff. Okay, so let's back up here a bit. Right, where he mentions here in the late 1970s, China was exhausted and traumatized from the destruction and hardship caused by the Cultural Revolution, right, which nearly destroyed us. Deng Xiaoping initiated reforms that brought stability. Okay, now some of the reforms that Deng Xiaoping initiated, he opened up a foreign zone in southern China, Guangdong, China. And that allowed like a lot of foreign companies to come in and build factories, produce a lot of massive stuff. Because I remember growing up in Brooklyn, we had lots of factories. So that means if you went to school, let's say you dropped out of school, right? You can go get a job. I mean, it was very easy. You could just go to a factory, you could walk in, and they hire you on the spot. That's how it used to be. We had lots of factories. You pass by, you hear all kinds of machinery moving, people making all kinds of stuff. And then during this time that he's talking about, which he failed to mention in his article, a lot of these jobs moved out from America and moved into China in that southern area where they were mass producing a lot of stuff and so forth. So many of our jobs moved over there to China, and that created a problem for us. That means you have to have maybe a college degree or technical degree or have some kind of a skill to really survive. You couldn't be just like somebody, who dropped out of high school. Back in those days, just work at a regular job and still was able to buy a house. You have many people like that. Own their own homes. They never went to college. They didn't have any trade. No. They could have worked in a hotel. Yeah, as a maid in Manhattan. And still were able to own their own home. Right here in New York City. But no, that's going to be very difficult now. It's very hard to pull that out. So he he declined to mention that, how Deng Xiaoping initiated these reforms. Those reforms were done by inviting a lot of foreign companies, especially American companies, and Wall Street was looking to earn more money. And the best thing they were able to do was send factories overseas. Look at the iPhone, for example, right? We can make the iPhone here in the United States, but they refuse to do it, right? I believe Steve Jobs, when he was alive, he was asked about that, if you're going to bring if you're gonna bring the factories back and make the iPhone, nope. Said no, no way. So they make it in China. The iPhones are one of the most expensive phones, and yet the pay in China, the salary. I mean, come on, the monthly salary maybe it's like maybe a week salary here in the United States. So they're making a lot of money. That's why Apple, they have so much money for one corporation, and they refuse to provide those jobs here in America. All our factories gone overseas. So this is something here that this guy, this writer doesn't mention, how China was able to become, more prosperous since Deng Xiaoping back in 1979 and 1980s. Yeah, those were the years when our factories picked up and moved, and they went to Asia and mostly to the foreign zone in southern China. And that's why China is much more wealthier today, because they took most of our jobs, our factory jobs.